Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup here that I have. Obviously I have my drawing here with the grid on it, and you can see the acetate is hinged so I could lift it. I'm actually using this blue pen for the lines so that the lines could actually be seen against the black. And that's kind of one of the keys of kind of having a grid on an acetate overlay like that, is you can actually change the color of the grid from the drawing. This was printed on my regular printer, so I bought ink, and the quality isn't great, but it's doable. I have a wide range of values on here. This is a Rubens. I also have my grid lines marked. It's 1 inch by 1 inch, so I have 10 inches this way and 8 inches this way. I just formatted the print to basically set it in Photoshop to print to the size of the printer paper. That way it was, not taking this drawing and shrinking it down too small. I was able to have it a little bit bigger. But if you are actually printing from a home printer, you're going to have to limit yourself to probably 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11. So I have cardboard backing this just so that I could take the image. Eventually I'm going to take this off once I continue to work with it. So it's just hinged on there. The paper itself, I'm using a paper where the value is pretty close and the color is pretty close to the original. And I used my acetate pad to get the corners because I wanted to pull into the middle, and one of the reasons I want to do that is if I'm actually working, I can work on the side here and do studies. So I'm just using the corner of the pad for my 90 degree, and then I set my marks. I do it again, and then I set it, and then I just add my grid to the paper. My setup for the pad is just a typical drawing board with clamps, and then I have two smaller clamps down at the bottom here so that the paper is completely held down. Now under the paper I have just one more sheet of paper under here, you can see, and I have that there so that the paper will protect this paper from the surface, so when I draw on it, it gives it a little bit of a buffer. You also, when you're clamping it, you don't want to be clamping onto the actual image itself, so you can see I do have a lot of space over here to actually work on. Now tools wise, for cutting, I'm just going to go through some of these. These are just different forms of cutting tools that you can use to cut your paper. Some of these bigger box cutters are a little bit overkill sometimes. But depending on what you're doing, this would be your cheapest would be this one, and then this is an art one I got at an art store, and then of course this is just an industrial one I got at Lowe's. If you open them up, there's always blades inside here, so if these end up getting too dull, open it up and change the blade. The most important thing about the blades is that they're super sharp, because if you're cutting your paper, a dull blade will start to rip the paper instead of cutting the paper, so you want to make sure that you cut it. Another thing that the dull blade will do is it will start to kind of bend the paper if it does actually cut it. These are smaller pen knives, and so for something like this, like a paper like this in a small piece, I'm probably going to only use an X-Acto pen knife. And this is just another one for cutting. And I actually use this when I travel to Europe and do drawing classes there because it's so light. I think it's titanium. Now the box cutter is also going to be used to cut the charcoal, so I'm going to show that in a minute. I have a box set up here. I ended up ordering paints, and so it just came in this perfect box, and then I took a bag and cut it and then flipped it over. That way, as I'm actually cutting the wood casing off of the charcoal, I could just let it fall into the bag and then just wrap the bag up and throw it away and put another one in as I go. So we'll kind of move to the charcoal right here, and I wanted to talk about the getting the tip out and getting the wood casing away from the charcoal. So as you can see, I'm not going to run this into a sharpener. I'm going to use my blade to cut the casing away from the charcoal, and then use my sandpaper pad, which is right here, and I'll use that for the actual tip if I need to. You got to remember, with the majority of the usage of charcoal, you're really not going to need a sharp tip until you're really rendering the piece. So the idea of kind of having to use the sandpaper pad for a tip is kind of useless for most of the time until you get to that to the last stages of the drawing. Personally, for cutting these, I like my Irwin box cutter the most because the blades are cheap and I could put new blades in there. It also has enough weight and it has enough size so that I can actually control the sharpening of the pencil. So as I'm going to do this, the most important thing that you do when you cut these is that you hold it like this and you control the blade by pushing outward with the thumb. So you can see I have probably about a 20-30 degree angle on it. And I'm not going to go too hard because I don't want to cut the charcoal or break the charcoal or snap it, because if I put a lot of pressure on it, it's just going to keep breaking it off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to push out, and I'm going to, you know, this blade is pretty sharp, so I don't have to put a lot of pressure on it. And then I just push outward like that. And I'm going to keep going in a circle motion. The one thing that's key to this is really not taking too much off at once. Just keep going around the circle. So as they're cutting it, I'm not taking an immense amount of wood away from the charcoal because I could keep coming around with it. And the reason you do that is because once you get into the very soft charcoal, it gets fragile and it'll break. So hopefully I could do this right and it won't break on me. But the further out that you get the charcoal from the casing, the more brittle it's going to be. So if you want something that's that long, it's going to be kind of tough to get it to that point. So you're going to see, I'm not going to take it too far, maybe half an inch or something like that. And you can see I've pulled it away. So the key is really pushing with the thumb and then moving the thing in a circle motion. And I'm just kind of turning it and pushing outward. You could push outward, or you can just, as you can see, I could pull the charcoal back into the knife that way. Okay, and you can see the bag being set up like this is going to prevent the charcoal from going over the paper. Although I do recommend, I don't have a lot of space here, I do recommend getting your paper out of the way when you do this, because you could start shedding and throwing the charcoal powder into the paper, and but it's no big deal. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my sanding pad and I'm going to begin to just run the charcoal in a circle motion again over the sanding pad. And eventually, I do this long enough, I'm going to get a tip. Some people like it to be, especially when you get to the very end, for these to be almost like needles when they're working. The most important thing isn't a tip, it's really getting the casing out of the actual charcoal. And we're going to do a video later where I'm going to actually draw, and I'm going to show you the proper way to draw and why this way of cutting the tool out is very important. These are extenders, of course. If your charcoal gets too short, you can add the extender to it and it's going to give more life to you. I think I got this one in Italy. These are a great investment to have for that reason, because if you kind of think about it, once the charcoal gets down to this level, it's kind of useless, so it gives it that life. The other thing is, if you're working with stick charcoal, you could put that into the extender too if you don't like holding directly onto the charcoal and getting your hands very dirty. So once this is filled enough, then basically I take the bag and pull it out and just put another one in. All I did was I cut right down the bag so that I could fit the bag over this, and then you could create a kind of guard here so that as it kind of jumps forward as you're cutting the wood off, it'll just hit the bag and go into it. Sharpeners, super important, and I did talk about the kneaded eraser and then the block eraser. These are malleable. They're great for taking a certain amount of charcoal down and pull. You can actually pull with it. So if you wanted to draw in a subtractive way, you can actually just pull it out. And so for things like hair, these are great. So the idea is to kind of take the charcoal and push the eraser into it and pull the charcoal off of the surface like that. And you can see eventually it just pulls it away. And what it's doing is it's pulling this away without actually breaching the integrity of the paper, so the tooth will continue to stay strong. With something like this, which is fine, but you can see as I rub it, I'm basically taking my paper tooth and I'm just beating my paper tooth down. And then of course you get all that crap and you have to rub it away, so then you start rubbing your drawing and your finger oils get into it. So personally I find these to be very problematic. They are useful at times, but you should be able to do 90% of your erasing with a kneaded eraser. This right here is caliper. I'm going to show this later once I get into working on this study. The caliper is a great tool because when you're working with a grid and you're trying to find a coordinate, all you have to do is find the two dots on here and then just place your dot down. A compass works fine as well. If I change the opening of this or the size, it's tight so it stays in place. When we get to site sizing, I'm going to talk more about this tool. Very useful for grids. If I have my old master copy here and I want to see what the distance is on this line here from here to here, I could check it with the caliper, and then I could take that caliper directly to the paper and transfer that measurement directly to the paper.